This new devastating report into Israel's bombing campaign against the people of Gaza exposes the genocidal mayhem unleashed by the Israeli state. It leaves no place to hide, zero for defenders of the Israeli state and its murderous behaviour in Gaza. All of their arguments, all of their defences destroyed, buried in the rubble, indeed, of Gaza. For those of us who live in states which have armed and facilitated this genocide, we have a responsibility to know what this report says. That's what we're going to talk about. Now, after all, the human catastrophe which has enveloped the Palestinian people was made possible because of the weaponry handed to Israel by Western states, principally by the United States, but the British government, as an example, still gives Israel the crucial components needed for the F-35 jets, which have reduced much of Gaza to an apocalyptic wasteland. This new report is produced by Air Wars. It's a UK-based organisation founded 1 decade ago or so, which came to prominence by tracking and archiving the aerial bombardment of so-called Islamic State, ISIS, and other such jihadi groups in Iraq and Syria in particular. They're run by a team of experts, and their impact goals, as described on their website, include to pressure governments and military actors to acknowledge and take responsibility for the full human toll of their actions, ensure measures to prevent human suffering, particularly amongst civilian populations, are centred in military policy and practice. This report focuses on the first 25 days of the onslaught against Gaza after Israeli President Isaac Herzog declared there were no uninvolved civilians in Gaza, when the defence minister and an Israeli general charged with civilian affairs had described those civilians as human animals and human beasts who, as the latter put it, would only get damage and hell. It's important to just put that here when I'm talking about this report, because always remember, they didn't hide what they were going to do. They made it clear, and we can link the overwhelming evidence produced by Air Wars to the stated intent of the Israeli state. Now, according to Air Wars, at least 5,139 civilians were killed in October 2023 in Gaza. Bear in mind, its pre-war population was about 2.2 million. Of those, at least 1,900 children were killed. And bear in mind, the vast majority of this was before the ground invasion. Air Wars say it is by far the most intense, destructive and fatal conflict for civilians that Air Wars has ever documented. The statistics speak for themselves and leave any suggestion that the Israeli state has sought to prevent civilian harm exposed for what it is: the unforgivable sin of atrocity denial. Just listen to this. Air Wars looked at 606 incidents of civilian harm in this 25-day period. In those 606 incidents, in which at least 5,139 civilians were killed, guess how many militants they established had been killed? Between 30 and 58. An academic who goes under History Speaks on Twitter, who I recommend, has done a pie chart graph which exposes the murderous absurdity of this crime. As the graph shows, 99.4% of these incidents killed civilians, with 0.6% killing militants. The most moral army in the world, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, what these statistics expose is a naked war of extermination. They find that when a named individual is killed, an average of 14 members of his or her family were also killed. Indeed, in the first year, over 900 entire Palestinian bloodlines in Gaza, that is, entire extended families, from little babies to great-grandparents, have been wiped from the face of the earth. I've said this before, but it's worth stating. If just one extended family in Britain, with a population over 30 times bigger than Gaza's pre-war population, if just one extended family were all violently wiped out here, that would be a national tragedy, remembered as such long after the horror happened. 900 entire bloodlines. Let me read this particular paragraph from the Air Wars report. Families were killed together in unprecedented numbers and in their homes. More than 9 out of 10 women and children were killed in residential buildings. In more than 95% of all cases where a woman was killed, at least one child was also killed. Now, Air Wars looked at where Palestinian civilians were being killed, and overwhelmingly they were being killed in their own homes, often in their own beds. Over 90% of female or child fatalities took place in residential buildings. A little note here, obviously it's the case that so many Palestinian men are not quote-unquote legitimate targets either. In this context, women and children are referred to because we are automatically able to conclude without further discussion that they are civilians. That doesn't mean we should disregard how many men have been butchered. For example, the first responders on the scene, who are often victims of double-tap attacks by the Israeli state. Now, Israel's defenders have repeatedly claimed this mass slaughter is caused by the use of so-called human shields in Gaza. Even on its own terms, this is a nonsense. Under international law, potential harm to civilians can only be justified proportionate to a military advantage and when necessary precautions are thereby taken. But in any case, the evidence for human shields is simply not there. The justifications go along the lines of, there's a big block of flats. In those flats, there's someone we've decided, or an artificial intelligence system has decided, I'll come on to that, is a legitimate military target. We're going to blow up that block of flats and kill a load of civilians, and then we'll behave as though all the people in that block are all human shields. As it is, Gaza is one of the most densely populated communities on Earth. And it should be said that when Iranian missile strikes targeted Israel, there was chatter about how a potential strike on the headquarters of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence services, could imperil civilian lives because it's surrounded by civilian infrastructure, as is the IDF headquarters, surrounded by civilian flats, shopping malls. Therefore, is the IDF and Mossad using human shields? Also, there's overwhelming evidence, even covered by the likes of the New York Times and CNN, that it is in fact Israel which keeps using Palestinian civilians as human shields because every accusation is a confession. And we know from Plus 975 magazine that, as I indicated there, artificial intelligence systems are used to identify targets without any human input, including one called, I would say, I kid you, no, this is a joke, a dark joke, a really messed up joke. It's called Where's Daddy? That's the program the Israeli state uses, where literally what happens is a man who is deemed a target, however low-lying, and in many cases, the AI has just selected someone who isn't in any way a legitimate target of any description. They get home and then they are blown up along with their children, their family, their neighbours. As air wars find, when civilians were killed alongside family members, at least 15 other members were killed. They note this is higher than any other conflict documented by air wars. Indeed, they show a graph comparing how many Palestinian civilians were killed in October 2023 with the most lethal month recorded in Iraq in the battle against ISIS during the Battle of Mosul in March 2017, where they find 1,470 civilians were killed by the US-led coalition compared to over 5,000 in Gaza. They look at the offensives against ISIS, which have often been used by apologists for Israel's genocide to suggest, well, lots of civilians were killed there, so this is okay. They find that in the Battle of Raqqa, and this is our speciality, by the way, in the Battle of Raqqa in Iraq against ISIS, in that whole 4-month period, there were less than half the civilian fatalities as in Gaza in that first 25 days. This isn't a war. It's a genocide. This is what extermination looks like. There's no attempt to protect civilians from harm here. You can see that. Here's a key point. The vast majority of civilians are not going to be killed by the violence. That we know that from precedent. I'm afraid in military onslaughts, which are far less destructive, even still, they're very destructive. But it's not the bombs or the bullets, it's other causes. The destruction of the fundamentals of society, like healthcare, housing, access to water, food. That's what's going to kill the biggest number of Palestinians. I hate to say it. It's the truth. Air Wars have done an incredibly important report here, and they detail one element of the extermination that the Palestinian people are suffering. It's one element, and it's hideous enough, but it's only going to be a minority. And they were looking only at the first few weeks. Obviously, every single day, Palestinians are just wiped out. With no headlines, wiped out, normalised. We'll never recover from this. We'll never be forgiven. The consequences will be catastrophic, I can assure you. There's no point pretending. This is one of the worst atrocities of our age, and it is up to us to keep screaming about it as loudly as we can. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts, your comments, help us take on the pro-genocide media, patreon.com/OJ84. Next week, I have one of the most important pieces of work I've ever worked on, which has taken me months, which exposes the BBC's coverage of the genocide based on interviews with multiple BBC journalists. So I very much look forward to finally publishing that. That'll be next week, hopefully middle of next week. Press like, subscribe, and I'll speak to you soon.